It was in September 1522 that a small sailing ship like this one limped back into a harbour in southern Spain. Its journey had lasted 36 months, and it was all that remained of a flotilla of 5 ships and 250 men which had been led by Ferdinand Magellan. Only 18 men returned. Magellan was not one of them. But one of Magellan's ships, the Victoria, achieved a momentous feat which marked world history as few other acts have ever done. In an extraordinary voyage of great arduousness, it had sailed right round the world. Magellan's expedition marked the start of the process by which European civilization came to dominate the globe. Between the birth of Christ and 1400, probably only the Vikings sailed more than 1,000 miles on an oceanic voyage away from Western Europe. The Vikings were fine sailors and skilled navigators. Viking ships were capable of very long journeys. They even reached Newfoundland in North America, but their Atlantic empire was a mouldering backwater by 1400, with its furthest outposts in Greenland dead or dying in total isolation. It was Magellan's voyage that proved that all the world was accessible from the water, that all the oceans were connected. Why did European ships and European states achieve this breakthrough? It was partly a matter of capital, and partly a matter of geography and technology and sailing skill. Those early voyages were very expensive indeed. They needed a royal patron like Charles I of Spain to be successful. It took 1.5 years to fit out Magellan's expedition, and even then the merchants of Seville cheated him with only half a year's supplies. He began to run out of essentials after he rounded Cape Horn and entered the Pacific. He encountered savages and bargained with them for food and water. On one of the islands in the Philippines, he fell into a skirmish and was killed. The expedition was left without a leader. Magellan's crew rallied and set off again to sail west around the rest of the world. An extraordinary achievement, which initiated an unparalleled era of European conquest. It could have been the Chinese who achieved this. They had the facilities and the technical knowledge. Their junks were developed to a high degree before 1400. They were capacious, sturdy, and effective sailing ships. Cheng He, one of their admirals, led several fleets as far west as Mogadishu in Africa in the early 15th century. But the Chinese bureaucrats resented the expense, and by 1500 Chinese merchants were forbidden to build the great ocean-going junks with more than 2 masts. Harbours like Canton were crowded with coasters and small vessels, not with great ships. The Arabs also had the technical knowledge to construct, navigate, and handle ocean-going ships. The Arab dhow is still today one of the world's great ship designs. But they never needed to travel very far, for the commercial network which supported the Arab states stretched from Morocco to the Far East, only requiring short journeys from one port to another. In any case, the Islamic states became more and more inward-looking and conservative. Their vast, ornate bureaucracies and elaborate architectural pursuits tended to swallow up nearly all of their resources for many centuries. Europe also had its network of trade routes before 1500. They stretched from Scandinavia to the coast of India and on to China. But when the Turks captured Constantinople in 1453, those links were broken. The Turkish Empire dominated the eastern end of the Mediterranean until the 19th century. Before the Turks got in the way, European traders had established respectful and business-like dealings with merchants in Arabia, India, and Central Asia. The Mughal emperors in India encouraged trade relations with the West. The power of Venice and Genoa had been based almost entirely on the revenue from the spice trade, which they controlled for many centuries. Now, as the Turks took over the Mediterranean, spices became much more expensive, and the Venetians' route to the east was troubled with bandits and local tolls. Venice became a backwater. The Portuguese were the first to profit. They developed what was to be the West's great source of strength, a relationship between the state and commerce. Henry the Navigator, the Portuguese king, persistently encouraged his merchants to explore the west coast of Africa. They even penetrated down past the perils of Cape Bojador. The Portuguese established a virtual monopoly of the spice trade by using India as a staging post to the Far East. They didn't conquer much territory, because in Tokugawa, Japan, Qing, China, and in Mughal, India, the Europeans encountered powerful and well-organized empires. But Portuguese bases on the coast of India dominated trade in the Indian Ocean. Europe as a whole benefited immensely as a result. Spices were sent from Portugal via Antwerp into Central Europe, and silver from new mines in Bohemia and Upper Hungary was exported in return. The silver mined in Hungary eventually found its way to the Far East. This made for the growth of the first world economy. The great merchant families of Central Europe flourished at this period. Men like Jacob Fugger made their money first as middlemen and then as bankers to the crown. It was a period of extreme opulence in southern Germany, and Dürer embellished it with his pictures. This process starved northern Italy of trade and resources and diverted merchants and money to other parts of Europe. The Mediterranean, which had been the center of Europe, entered upon a decline. Western Europe, by contrast, now opened up transatlantic trade and developed the Atlantic economy. The impact of European expansion across the Atlantic was revolutionary. It changed the destiny of the whole Western Hemisphere and of the continent of Africa. A transatlantic economy was created on the basis of the massive trade in slaves between Africa and America. Feudal societies in medieval Western Europe had not made much use of imported slaves and slavery. But in the Mediterranean world of the Renaissance, there was a considerable slave trade, which was largely organized by the maritime entrepreneurs of both Genoa and Venice. The word slave originally derived from the word Slav, and in the Middle Ages, slaves from the Black Sea area labored on sugar plantations in eastern Mediterranean islands and as domestic slaves in Italy. Francesco d'Attini, the pious and celebrated merchant of Prato, seen here kneeling in front of the Virgin, was a large-scale importer and wholesaler of slaves. The Portuguese emerged as the first great slavers to the Atlantic world. It's easy to see why. For generations, the Portuguese crown had subsidized the exploration of Africa and now demanded a commercial return from it. Portuguese ships went everywhere, and Portuguese merchants dominated trade with India and Asia for 100 years. Asian portraits and miniatures describe the vigor with which they competed for gold, ivory, pepper, and slaves. They squabbled and fought incessantly. The Portuguese and Spaniards were first into the field and clashed on many occasions. In 1494 they carved up the world between them, with Portugal claiming Africa and most of Asia, as well as the eastern parts of South America. Spain got the rest. Of course, they didn't actually possess more than a tiny fraction of these territories, but Portuguese holdings in Africa, South America and Asia, and Spanish holdings in Central America and the East Indies were significant and strategic outposts of European influence. By 1535, the conquistadors under Cortés and Pizarro had seized whole new kingdoms for Spain in Central and South America. Within 40 years, the Spanish controlled vast areas between Mexico and Chile. They enslaved the local populations and treated them like animals, and the natives responded by dying out. In a few of the smaller West Indian islands, the fierce Caribs, after whom the region was named, established native reservations by the simple expedient of butchering, eating, and torturing the Spaniards who dared to land. But in New Spain, now Central America, exploitation and extermination went hand in hand. Wherever the Spaniards went, they introduced large-scale sheep and cattle ranching which took over from native agriculture. Their presence was culturally, socially, and physically disruptive. They also introduced diseases such as malaria, smallpox, and measles, to which the Indians had no resistance whatsoever. The result was demographic catastrophe on a scale without parallel in world history. The population of New Spain before the conquest may have been as high as 25 million. By 1532 it was down to 17 million. By 1548, the total Indian population of New Spain was probably little more than 6 million. After yet another murderous epidemic in 1576 to 79, the figure fell to below 2 million. In Peru and other areas of Spanish conquest, there were also devastating epidemics and massive falls in the population. Yet the Spaniards needed labor, especially for their silver mines in Mexico and the Andes. The Spanish crown was surviving on its share of the American bullion, which it used as collateral for loans. European trade with Asia was increasingly funded by American silver. At this time, pieces of 8 became the standard trading currency throughout the world. In practice, the near extermination of the natives in South America caused the Spaniards to search for new sources of labor elsewhere. In South America, the processes of westernization involved on the one hand conversion to Christianity, and on the other the importation and exploitation of black slaves. African slaves were imported to replace the dead Indians. The golden century of Spain lasted roughly until the middle of the 17th century, and it left Hispanic civilization dominating a vast area of the globe. But the heart soon went out of Spanish endeavor. Population decline, price inflation, heavy taxation, and a very expensive set of land wars in the Netherlands wrecked Spain. By 1680, Spaniards were forbidden to read virtually all foreign books, even handbooks of shipbuilding. The result was that Spain became backward. The shipyards at Carano, which had once dominated the seas, went on producing exactly the same expensive and outdated vessels, and the Spanish navy and merchant marine fell prey to more energetic nations. Of these, the first were the Dutch. When the center of Europe's economic gravity shifted to the northwest, the Dutch were well placed to take advantage. The 17th century was dominated by them, and they stamped the modern world indelibly. Holland had few natural advantages apart from the ingenuity of its people. The Dutch became resourceful, practical, and well organized. Their towns were clean and comfortable. The people were well fed. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the Dutch had many opportunities and made use of them. They had won their land in an unremitting fight against the sea, and had constructed dikes and ditches and canals of enormous complexity. Flemish ditchers and drainers were already known for their skills all over Europe, even in the 10th century. As fishermen, they were adept at sailing far and cheaply in search of the herring on which they mainly lived. Their ships became involved in the transporting of Baltic products to the Mediterranean. The Dutch fleet was capacious, beamy, unarmed, and an effective carrier of all sorts of merchandise. Another of their special qualities was that, at the time of the Reformation, they, like many seafaring peoples, were tolerant of other religions. Their own faith was predominantly Protestant, often of an extreme Calvinist caste, which brought upon them the rage of their Catholic Spanish rulers and provoked a war lasting 80 years. It also caused a division of the Netherlands between the Protestant north, of which the chief town was Amsterdam, and the Catholic south, now Belgium, with its capital at Brussels. During the 80 Years' War, and after the Peace of Munster in 1648, refugees from religious persecution from all over the Catholic world flocked to Amsterdam. These entrepreneurs and merchants and students could not survive in the persecuting and corrupt world of the Counter-Reformation, and they all brought capital and technical skills to the northern Netherlands. The result was an explosion profoundly affecting everything that it touched. It could be said that the modern world was invented by the Dutch. By 1630 they had large ships plying in Asiatic waters. They began to dominate the eastern trade and gradually ousted the Portuguese. In Africa, they replaced the Portuguese as slavers and imperial panjandrums. Everywhere they went, they made their mark. Their trade routes linked outposts of Dutch territories strategically placed to allow easy communications with India and the East. The Dutch also proved far better than anyone else at trading and collecting money for long-term commercial risks. In a unique way, they trusted each other and worked together, and their government, the States General, protected commerce instead of living parasite fashion from it, as the Catholic counter-Reformation states were beginning to. Dutchmen were the pioneers in international law and trade. The Bank of Holland in 1604 was the world's first national bank. The Dutch commercial explosion went hand in hand with scientific and technological advances. But, in the end, the Dutch lacked indigenous resources, and by the late 17th century they were overtaken by their near neighbors, the English. The English had a history of alternate fits of self-destruction and self-assertion. In the late 17th century, the City of London and the powerful British nobility combined to compete against the Dutch. The English pioneered the development of accurate navigational chronometers, which allowed Cook and others to explore and chart new areas of the world. By the middle of the 18th century, they were capable of equipping every officer of the deck with an adequate and accurate pocket watch. These navigational developments went hand in hand with commercial and industrial energy. Ships for the British East India Company were virtually mass-produced at Greenwich. The prosperity of 18th century British coastal towns like Bristol was based almost entirely on the slave trade. The merchants of Bristol and similar towns pioneered the Atlantic economy, and the success of their enterprises allowed them to amass great profits. But by 1780, the horrors of the slave trade began to torment the Western European conscience, although it was not stamped out for many years. But as a result of the profits of slaving, European nations, especially the British, were able to consolidate their overseas empires. The British, unlike the Dutch, systematically conquered as much of the world as they possibly could. France was a principal rival in America, South America, and India, but France, like Holland, was distracted by land wars in Europe, and in 1763, by the Peace of Paris, the British took over her territory. That and other subsequent conquests were the genesis of the British Empire. Between 1500 and 1800, Europeans became used to confronting and surviving the dangers of the sea. The Dutch led the way, but their strength was sapped by land wars in Europe, and it was the British, who had no such distractions, who took the lead in empire building. It was the British who were the eventual heirs of the Portuguese explorers of the 15th and 16th centuries.